The lantern light flickered across the packed barn, its shadow stretching like claws on the wooden beams. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred by the restless shuffling of boots and the scrape of gunmetal against leather. Men lined the walls, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, the silence broken only by the tense creak of the floorboards. At the center of it all, Elias McCord stood with his Colt drawn, his eyes locked on the figure across from him. The air carried the heavy stench of sweat, gun oil, and fear. Ahyana, her hands bound with coarse iron chains, stood at the makeshift podium where she'd been displayed. Her dark braids fell over her shoulders, beads glinting faintly under the swaying lanterns. She didn't flinch, not even as Sheriff Kane barked orders and pointed toward her like she was nothing more than cattle up for trade. Behind him, Rourke smirked, fingers hovering above the butt of his revolver, daring anyone to move. The crowd was restless. Some whispered, others kept their eyes low, unwilling to challenge the spectacle unfolding before them. Judge Tully sat in the shadows, gavel resting lazily in his palm, as though this was all part of the law's design. His presence was more chilling than the pistols, because everyone knew his word could make murder look righteous. Elias' breath was shallow, his jaw tight. He hadn't come here for blood, but the barn was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and the spark was already burning. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as his gun hand trembled, not with fear, but with the crushing weight of choice. The room wasn't just watching Ahyana. They were watching him. Sheriff Kane's voice cut through the tension like a whip. "Pick any bride for free," he snarled, jabbing a finger at the chained Comanche woman. "This one's worth less than the dirt under your boots." The laughter that followed was ugly, mean, the kind that made the air itself feel heavier. Yet Elias didn't laugh. His eyes lingered on Ahyana's steady gaze, a defiance that burned even through her silence. And in that moment, Elias realized the truth. They hadn't come for the cattle. They hadn't even come for her. Every gun, every shadow, every hateful laugh was aimed at him. The morning sun rolled across the open plains, burning away the night's chill and bathing the Donovan ranch in a golden haze. Elias McCord leaned against a worn fence post, hammer in hand, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. The sound of iron nails meeting splintered wood echoed across the pasture as he fixed yet another section of broken fence. Cattle grazed lazily in the distance, their tails flicking at flies, the smell of dust and manure thick in the heat. For a moment, life felt ordinary, quiet, just another day in a world where survival depended on calloused hands and stubborn will. He paused to wipe the grit from his brow, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where the land seemed endless. This was the West he knew, hard, vast, and unforgiving. His boots pressed into the dirt as he reached for his canteen, the warm water doing little to soothe the dryness in his throat. When he mounted his horse, Buckshot, and started the ride toward town, the wind carried the faint creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves on packed earth. It was the kind of morning that fooled a man into thinking the world was steady. Sweetwater's main street buzzed with the usual shuffle of life. Women carried baskets of flour and cloth, children darted between wagon wheels, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out steady as a heartbeat. Elias tied Buckshot outside the general store and stepped onto the wooden planks, his spurs jingling lightly. He nodded at Miriam Graves, who was unloading jars from a crate, her sharp eyes softening for a brief moment as she greeted him. She was one of the few in town who still treated him like a man, not just another gun for hire. Inside the store, Elias picked up salt, beans, and a coil of rope. It was there that he noticed the stranger. Tall, shoulders broad beneath a weather-beaten coat, the man's face was shadowed under the brim of his hat. He whispered something to Deputy Caleb Boone, who looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight, glancing at Elias, then quickly away. Whatever was said, it was not meant for public ears. Elias felt the prickle of unease crawl across his skin. On his way back out, he spotted something unusual near the courthouse steps. A wagon had rolled in, its canvas pulled back to reveal chained figures inside, Comanche captives. Most were men, guarded by armed deputies, but among them stood a young woman with long braids and a calm, steady gaze. Even through the grime and weariness, her presence radiated defiance. Elias slowed his stride, his eyes meeting hers for just a breath of a moment, and something inside him shifted. The sheriff barked at the crowd to keep moving, but Elias didn't. The smell of leather, the rattle of chains, the uneasy murmurs of the townsfolk all pressed down on him. Something about the sight didn't feel like business as usual. It felt like trouble, the kind of trouble a man couldn't just ride away from. And as he turned back toward Buckshot, Elias knew deep down that this day was different. Elias McCord sat on the porch of the saloon that evening, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, though he hadn't touched it in a while. His hands rested heavy on his knees, his gaze locked on the courthouse across the street. The memory of the wagon and the chained Comanche woman refused to leave his mind. Her eyes had followed him, not pleading, not broken, just steady, as if daring him to do something. He told himself it wasn't his fight. He'd seen enough men torn apart for less. Still, the thought gnawed at him like a splinter too deep to pull out. Inside the saloon, the chatter was restless. Ranchers argued about stolen cattle, settlers grumbled about the railroad men cutting through land that wasn't theirs, and a few whispered about the Comanche captives brought in under Sheriff Bart Kane's orders. Some said they were prisoners of war, others said it was nothing but a crooked business deal dressed up as justice. Elias heard it all, but he stayed silent, chewing on the bitterness of knowing how this town worked. Justice here was measured by who held the gavel and who held the guns. As the night stretched on, Tom Malloy, an old rancher whose beard was as white as sun-bleached bone, shuffled over to Elias. "You stay clear of this one, son," Tom muttered, leaning close. "Sheriff Kane's got the judge in his pocket, and that gunslinger Rourke at his back. Nothing good comes of fightin' men who already wrote the law in their favor." His words carried the weight of a man who had once tried and failed to challenge the system. Elias gave a curt nod, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. When Elias finally left the saloon, he nearly collided with Deputy Caleb Boone outside. The young deputy looked uneasy, his face pale under the lamplight. "Don't get involved, McCord," Caleb whispered. "You hear me? They'll be put on display tomorrow, called a lawful auction." He swallowed hard, lowering his voice. "And if anyone interferes, Kane won't hesitate to bury them 6 feet deep." His boots scuffed nervously against the dirt as he turned away, leaving Elias with more questions than answers. Elias walked slowly down the street, the night air cool against his skin. The chains he had seen rattling in the wagon seemed louder in his memory than the chirp of crickets. He could ride out before dawn, pretend none of it concerned him. That was the safe choice. But safe didn't feel right, not after looking into that young woman's eyes. Something about her presence refused to let him turn his back. By the time he reached his horse, Elias knew he was standing at a crossroads. Walk away and let injustice fester, or step into the fire, knowing it could burn everything he had left. He clenched his jaw, his hand brushing the worn grip of his revolver. The night was quiet, but in the silence he heard it clear: this wasn't just another passing storm. This was the beginning of a war. The following morning broke with a thin veil of smoke drifting in from the southern hills. Elias noticed it first as he rode the fence line, a faint gray streak rising against the pale blue sky. Fires weren't uncommon in summer, but something about it felt deliberate, almost like a signal. Buckshot's ears twitched at the distant sound of hooves, though the horizon showed nothing but shimmering heat. Elias narrowed his eyes, unease stirring again, the kind that always came before the storm. When he rode into Sweetwater, the streets buzzed with a strange energy. Men spoke in hushed tones, women pulled children closer, and the blacksmith hammered harder than usual, his rhythm tense, impatient. A flyer nailed to the post outside the courthouse caught Elias's attention. It bore Judge Tully's seal, announcing the lawful auction of tribal prisoners to be held at sundown in the town barn. The language dripped with formality, but Elias could see through it plain enough: it was nothing but legalized theft of human lives. Near the general store, Miriam Graves argued with Sheriff Kane in a voice sharp enough to draw a crowd. "You can't sell people, Bart," she snapped, her fists clenched at her sides. The sheriff just tipped his hat, his grin full of venom. "Law says otherwise, ma'am. Best you keep to your own chores." Clint Rourke lingered nearby, leaning against a post, his hand resting casually on his revolver. His eyes slid toward Elias, a silent warning that felt heavier than words. Later that day, Elias wandered past the stockyards and overheard 2 ranch hands muttering near the water trough. "Heard Red Elk's people are camped not 10 miles from here," one whispered. "They're not gonna take kindly to their kin being sold off." The other spat into the dirt. "Then we'll see war before week's end." Their voices carried the weight of fear, not bravado. Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. Protecting the young woman wasn't just dangerous, it could ignite something far bigger than himself. By dusk, the barn was already being prepared. Lanterns were strung along the rafters, casting a sickly yellow glow. Elias watched from the shadows as deputies paced outside, rifles slung over their shoulders. Inside, chains rattled as the captives were herded into place. He caught sight of Ahyana again, standing tall despite the restraints. Her calmness unsettled him more than panic ever could. She didn't look like someone defeated. She looked like someone waiting. As night settled, Elias leaned against the hitching post, his hand brushing the revolver at his side. The smoke from the hills grew thicker, closer now, carried on the evening wind. Hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance, too many to be coincidence. Elias knew then the problem wasn't just inside the barn. Trouble was closing in from every side, and it would find him sooner than he wanted. The barn was packed tighter than a cattle car, the heat stifling beneath the lanterns as men jostled for space. Elias stood near the rear, his hat pulled low, trying to blend into the sea of boots and spurs. The captives were lined along the center rail, iron shackles gleaming under the lamplight. Ahyana stood among them, shoulders square, her chin lifted high. Even in chains, she carried herself with more dignity than the men laughing at her expense. Sheriff Kane swaggered onto the platform, his star pinned proudly to his chest, though everyone knew it meant little more than the weight of a coin. Judge Tully followed, gavel in hand, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And then Rourke appeared, his black hat shadowing his grin, the predator among jackals. The room quieted at once. Everyone understood Rourke's reputation. He'd killed men for less than a sideways glance, and now his presence made the auction feel more like a death sentence. The bidding began as a cruel joke. Two men tossed out figures for an older captive, chuckling as though haggling over livestock. Elias's fists clenched at his sides. He forced himself to stay still, to wait, though every muscle in him screamed to act. When Sheriff Kane announced Ahyana's turn, the laughter grew louder, harsher. "Pick any bribe for free," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the rafters. "Even this one, if you've got the stomach for wild blood." The crowd jeered, some shouting vile remarks. That was when Elias shifted forward. His boots echoed on the floorboards as the crowd parted slightly, eyes widening as they recognized him. He didn't speak right away, he just stared at Kane, then at Rourke, letting the silence press heavy. "You call this law?" Elias finally asked, his voice low but steady. The words cut through the noise like a blade. The sheriff smirked, leaning on the podium. "Law's what we say it is, McCord. Ain't that right, Judge?" Tully tapped his gavel once, the sound hollow. Rourke stepped down from the shadows, hand resting on his revolver. "Careful, cowboy," he drawled. "Men who get righteous in this town don't live long enough to preach twice." His eyes glinted, challenging Elias to make the first mistake. Around them, the crowd murmured nervously, some eager for blood, others shifting uneasily at the thought of what might come. Elias could feel every gaze on him, the air thick with expectation. He glanced at Ahyana one more time. Her eyes met his, unwavering, as though she already knew he would stand for her. And in that moment, Elias understood there would be no quiet way out. He had made his choice, and there would be no turning back. Whatever came next, it would not end without gunfire. The barn erupted in chaos after Elias's challenge. Kane barked for order, deputies raised their rifles, and Rourke's hand hovered like a vulture over his revolver. For a breath, Elias thought he'd drawn his last line in the dirt. But then a voice rose from the captives, deep and steady, cutting through the noise. It was Nakoma, Ahyana's brother. His words, spoken in both English and his native tongue, drew the crowd's attention away from the guns. "She is not a prisoner," he shouted. "She is the daughter of Red Elk, blood of a chief. Harm her, and you invite war." The words rippled through the barn like a thrown stone across water. Murmurs spread fast, men shifting uncomfortably as they realized this wasn't just a nameless woman in chains. This was leverage, power, and danger rolled into one. Judge Tully's grin faltered, his gavel lowering slowly. Sheriff Kane's jaw tightened, though he tried to mask it with a bark of laughter. Chief's daughter or not, the law's clear. She's here under my authority." But the sheriff's bravado rang thinner now, his eyes darting nervously toward Rourke, who simply smiled wider. Elias felt the weight of Nakoma's revelation settle heavy on his chest. Protecting Ahyana wasn't just about saving one woman anymore, it meant standing between Sweetwater and the fury of the Comanche nation. Every instinct told him to step back, to let someone else carry that burden. But as he looked at Ahyana, her chin still high despite the shackles, he knew stepping back would haunt him far worse than any bullet. Tensions in the barn shifted. Some of the townsfolk, once jeering, now whispered about the risk of bloodshed. A few men shuffled toward the exit, unwilling to be caught in the storm. Miriam Graves, standing near the back, caught Elias's eye and gave the faintest shake of her head, as if to warn him that the fire was already spreading. Yet, in that same moment, Deputy Caleb Boone moved closer to Elias, his voice low. "She's worth more than they're saying. More than Kane knows. But if you interfere, you'll force Kane's hand. And Rourke will kill you just for breathing wrong." Clint Rourke stepped forward at last, boots thudding against the floorboards, his smile razor-sharp. "A chief's daughter, eh?" he drawled. "Then she's not just a prize. She's a weapon. And the man who holds her controls the battlefield." His words were deliberate, meant to claim her for himself. The crowd stiffened, sensing his ambition stretched far beyond Kane's petty corruption. Elias's hand drifted closer to his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. The gavel cracked down, Judge Tully's voice trembling now as he tried to command the room. "Order! Order, damn it!" But order was gone. In its place was the grim certainty that what lay ahead would not be settled with coin or law, it would be settled with blood and loyalty. And Elias, for better or worse, had already chosen where he stood. The night pressed heavy over Sweetwater, the streets lit only by lanterns swaying in the wind. Elias walked with purpose, each step echoing across the wooden planks. Word had spread fast, the sheriff was planning to move Ahyana and the other captives before dawn. If that happened, Elias knew they'd vanish into the hands of men like Rourke, their fate sealed beyond rescue. He tightened the strap of his holster, the weight of his revolver a grim reminder that tonight would test him more than any gunfight before. Outside the barn, deputies stood guard in pairs, rifles glinting faintly. Elias crouched behind a wagon, scanning their movements, searching for a gap. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from the understanding that one mistake would end him. He had faced outlaws, rustlers, and killers before, but never the full weight of a corrupt law bearing down on him. When the guards shifted toward the far end of the fence, he slipped through the shadows, boots whispering against the dirt. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, sweat, and iron. The captives were chained in a row, their eyes widening as Elias appeared out of the dark. Nakoma tensed, his expression torn between suspicion and hope. Ahyana, however, met Elias's gaze with quiet steadiness, as though she had expected him. He pressed a finger to his lips, then knelt to examine the chains. His hands trembled, not from nerves, but from urgency. He had to move fast, and the metal was thick as a blacksmith's pride. But before he could act, a voice sliced through the stillness. "You picked the wrong night, McCord." Rourke stepped from the shadows, pistol already drawn, his grin sharp as broken glass. Behind him, two deputies leveled rifles, their faces pale in the lantern glow. Elias froze, his hand hovering over his revolver. He was cornered, three guns aimed at his chest, no clean way out. His breath came slow, steady, as he measured the space between life and death. Rourke's voice was a snake's hiss. "Thought you'd play hero? You're not saving anyone. You're digging your own grave." The deputies shifted nervously, their fingers twitching on the triggers. Elias glanced at Ahyana, her calm gaze, her unwavering strength, and something sparked inside him. He might die here, but he refused to die as a man who stood idle in the face of injustice. His hand slid lower, fingertips brushing the grip of his Colt. The standoff stretched, every heartbeat louder than the last. And then Elias made his choice. With nothing left but desperation and resolve, he drew his gun, the barn erupting in thunder as the first shot split the night. The gunfire rattled the barn like a lightning storm. Elias's Colt barked once, dropping one of the deputies before he could even fire. The other's rifle cracked, splintering wood inches from Elias's head. Horses outside whinnied in panic, their hooves thundering against the ground as lanterns swung violently on their hooks. Elias dubbed behind a hay bale, dust filling his lungs, the sharp tang of gunpowder burning his nose. Every sound was deafening, every second stretched to eternity. Rourke advanced through the haze, boots steady, eyes gleaming with the thrill of the kill. "You're finished, McCord," he snarled, his revolver cocked. "No one crosses me and lives." He fired, the bullet tearing through the hay inches from Elias's shoulder. Elias returned fire, forcing Rourke to duck behind a post. The barn roared with echoes, wood cracking, sparks flying from iron chains as stray bullets ricocheted. The captives pressed against the walls, terrified yet silent, unwilling to draw attention that might cost them their lives. In the chaos, Ahyana's voice cut through, calm and sharp. "Rourke fears more than you think." Her words froze Elias just long enough to glance at her. Her eyes weren't on him, they were on Deputy Boone, who had slipped in during the firefight, gun in hand, his face pale as moonlight. Caleb's hands trembled, but his weapon wasn't aimed at Elias. It was aimed at Rourke. For the first time, the predator's grin faltered. "Put that down, boy," Rourke growled, his voice low and venomous. Boone swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his brow. "No," he stammered. "I've seen enough. You're not Lot, you're just a butcher." His words trembled, but they carried the weight of truth. The barn held still, even the groans of wounded men quieting under the weight of the moment. Elias used the pause to shift, pressing his back against the post, waiting for the slimmest opening. For the first time, Rourke wasn't untouchable. He was vulnerable. Sheriff Kane stormed through the doors, shouting for control, but what he saw froze him mid-step, Boone standing against Rourke, the townsfolk outside crowding at the barn's entrance, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The sheriff's authority cracked in that instant, the crowd seeing him for what he was, a man hiding behind others' guns. Judge Tully's face paled in the corner, his gavel useless now, the weight of justice collapsing around him. Elias rose from the dust, his revolver steady. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice rough but certain. Boone held his ground, Ahyana's gaze burning with silent strength, and the townsfolk pressing closer with every breath. The balance of power shifted, fragile but real. And in that moment, for the first time, hope flickered in the darkness of the barn. The barn stood silent in the smoky haze, every eye fixed on the man at its center. Elias kept his revolver leveled, chest heaving, his boots firm in the dirt. Boone's pistol still aimed at Rourke, though his hands shook with the weight of betrayal. Sheriff Kane barked orders that no one followed, his voice cracking as the crowd began to murmur louder, restless and hungry for justice. For the first time, Kane's badge gleamed not with power, but with shame. Rourke sneered, though his confidence faltered. "You think they'll stand with you, boy?" he spat at Boone. "They'll hang you right next to him." He jerked his chin toward Elias. But the crowd didn't echo his words this time. Instead, Miriam Graves stepped forward, her voice ringing clear, "No more." Others joined, ranchers, townsfolk, even the blacksmith, who slammed his hammer down against the barn wall. The sound reverberated like a verdict. The spell of fear that had kept the town chained to Kane and Rourke was breaking. Judge Tully raised his gavel, desperate to reassert control, but the crowd surged, shouting him down. "This is no law," a farmer yelled. "This is thievery." Another voice followed, "Murderers, the lot of them." The judge's gavel slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground like the death of his authority. Kane's face drained of color as his deputies shifted uneasily, no longer sure whose side they were on. Elias seized the moment. "Let her go," he ordered, nodding toward Ahyana. "Let them all go. Or we end this with blood tonight." His voice was raw, commanding, and though his body ached with exhaustion, the fire in his eyes left no room for doubt. Ahyana stood taller, chains rattling, her presence a silent reminder that this fight was about more than one man's courage, it was about the dignity of an entire people. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Boone took the first step. He lowered his pistol from Rourke, turned it instead on Sheriff Kane, and said firmly, "Unlock them." Gasps rippled through the barn. Kane's lips curled in fury, but his hand hesitated on the keys at his belt. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising, demanding release. Under that weight, Boone's defiance, Elias's revolver, the townsfolk's fury, Kane finally relented. The keys jingled as he handed them over, his authority crumbling with the gesture. One by one, the chains fell, the metallic clatter like thunder rolling across the barn floor. Nakoma stepped free, his eyes fierce yet grateful. Ahyana's wrists bore deep marks from the shackles, but her spirit was unbroken. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping the barn, no longer a prisoner but a symbol of resistance. For the first time, Sweetwater witnessed justice not from a gavel, but from courage, and it changed everything. Months later, the winds of Sweetwater carried a quieter song. The barn where chains once clattered had been torn down, its beams repurposed for a community hall. Where shouts of hatred once rang, children now played, their laughter echoing off the same walls that had witnessed cruelty. Elias McCord leaned against the fence near the edge of town, his hat tipped low against the sun, watching as people moved about with something unfamiliar in their step, dignity. The scars of what had happened hadn't vanished, but the town had found a way to breathe again. Ahyana stood among them, no longer a captive, but a bridge between worlds. Her presence was both a reminder and a promise. She walked freely through Sweetwater, carrying herself with the same quiet strength she had shown in chains. Some still looked at her with mistrust, but many more nodded with respect. When she spoke at the dedication of the new hall, her words were simple: "We are not forgotten. We are not for sale. We stand." It was not just her people she spoke for, it was every soul who had tasted the bitterness of injustice. Deputy Caleb Boone, once a trembling shadow of law, now wore his badge with the weight of conviction. He had chosen a side that night in the barn, and though it cost him friends and earned him enemies, it gave him something greater: integrity. Elias watched him grow into the kind of lawman Sweetwater needed, not perfect, but honest. And though Boone's eyes sometimes betrayed the ghosts of his choices, they also carried the strength of a man who refused to be silent again. Rourke and Kane were gone. One buried in the dust after a final gunshot, the other vanished into the wind with his shame. Judge Tully had resigned, leaving his gavel abandoned like a relic of a broken system. In their absence, the town forged something new, fragile but real, a justice born not of titles, but of people willing to stand. Elias never fooled himself into believing it would last forever, but he took comfort in knowing he had witnessed a spark catch flame. On the edge of town, Elias visited often with Nakoma and his kin. Around the fire, they shared stories, some bitter, some proud, binding old wounds with truth. Ahyana sometimes joined, her laughter soft yet strong, carrying into the night like a reminder that survival was more than endurance, it was defiance. In those moments, Elias felt something he hadn't known in years: peace, even if fleeting. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elias stood by the fence line, watching the sky burn with color. He thought of all that had been lost and all that had been saved. His hand brushed the worn grip of his revolver, though he hadn't needed it in weeks. And he said quietly, almost to himself, sometimes, in the West, the fastest draw wasn't the one that saved lives, it was the hand that reached out first.